The envelope trembled in my hands as I stared at the return address. My mother's distinctive handwriting spelling out demands I never thought I'd see. 3 months had passed since that afternoon when Cordelia Valdres walked into my clinic, her eyes widening with surprise and something else I couldn't quite identify when she realized I owned the entire practice. What had started as a chance encounter had spiraled into a relentless campaign of guilt, manipulation, and financial demands that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about our relationship. My name is Serafina Valdres, though everyone calls me Sarah, and at 34, I own one of the most successful dermatology clinics in Millbrook Heights. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent years perfecting the art of healing skin while never quite managing to develop a thick enough layer of my own when it came to my mother's particular brand of emotional warfare. The letter in my hands was the fourth this month, each one more demanding than the last, each one calculating my supposed debt to her with the precision of an accountant and the ruthlessness of a loan shark. Dr. Valdres, your 2:30 appointment is here. My receptionist, Ingrid, called through the intercom, her voice pulling me back from the paper that felt like it might combust in my grip. I folded the letter carefully, sliding it into my desk drawer with the others, and tried to compose myself. My patients deserved better than a doctor distracted by family drama, no matter how consuming it had become. But as I walked toward the examination room, my mother's words echoed in my mind. 28 years of food, shelter, clothing, and care don't come free, Serafina. It's time you acknowledged what you owe. The calculation she'd provided was staggering. $237,000, itemized down to the cost of my childhood vitamins and the orthodontic work I'd received at age 15. She'd even included interest, compounded annually at what she called a reasonable rate of return. Reading it had felt like being presented with a bill for my own existence, as if love and care were services rendered rather than the natural obligation of a parent to a child. But what disturbed me most wasn't the audacity of her demands. It was how familiar the manipulation felt, how it connected to patterns I'd spent decades trying to understand. Growing up as Cordelia Valdres's daughter had been an exercise in constantly owing something I could never quite repay, constantly falling short of standards that shifted like sand beneath my feet. My mother had always been beautiful in the way that demanded attention and got it. Even now, at 59, she possessed the kind of striking features that made people stop and stare, the kind of presence that filled a room before she'd even spoken. Tall and elegant, with dark hair she kept in a perfect chignon, and clothes that never showed a wrinkle, Cordelia had built her life around the admiration of others and the control it afforded her. I remembered being 8 years old, standing in our kitchen while she explained why I couldn't have the art supplies I'd asked for. "Money doesn't grow on trees, Serafina," she'd said, her voice carrying that particular tone of martyrdom she'd perfected. "Every dollar I spend on you is a dollar I can't spend on necessities. Perhaps if you were more grateful for what you already have, you'd understand the sacrifices I make." The conversation had ended with me apologizing for asking, though I couldn't articulate what exactly I was sorry for. That pattern had repeated throughout my childhood, a constant cycle of need, request, denial, and guilt that left me feeling perpetually indebted for the basic necessities of survival. School clothes were purchased with sighs and complaints about the cost. When I needed glasses at age 10, my mother spent weeks lamenting the expense, making sure I understood that my poor eyesight was an additional burden on her already strained resources. When I expressed interest in science camp during middle school, she calculated the cost down to the penny and made it clear that such luxuries were beyond our means, despite the fact that she'd just returned from a weekend spa retreat with her friends. The contradictions had been glaring even to my young mind, but questioning them only brought more lectures about gratitude and sacrifice. I learned early that it was easier to want nothing than to endure the guilt that came with expressing any needs or desires. By high school, I'd stopped asking for anything beyond the absolute necessities, and even those requests were couched in apologies and assurances that I would somehow make it up to her. College had been my escape, though even that had come with strings attached. My mother had co-signed my student loans with great ceremony, making sure I understood the magnitude of her generosity in putting her own credit at risk for my education. The monthly reminders about the loans, the updates on how much I owed, the casual mentions of how my education was affecting her financial stability, all of it was delivered with the kind of loving concern that made it impossible to protest without seeming ungrateful. Medical school had been even worse. The loans were larger, the stakes higher, and my mother's martyrdom had reached new heights. She'd developed a habit of mentioning my debt at family gatherings, sighing dramatically about the sacrifices she was making to ensure my future. Relatives would nod sympathetically, praising her selflessness, while I sat there feeling like a financial burden wrapped in medical textbooks. But I'd persevered, driven by a determination that surprised even me. Something about the precision of medicine, the clear cause and effect relationships, the ability to diagnose and treat problems with scientific methodology had appealed to me in ways I couldn't fully explain. Perhaps it was the contrast to my home life, where problems were never addressed directly, where complaints were constant but solutions were rarely sought. Dermatology had chosen me as much as I'd chosen it. During my residency, I discovered a talent for seeing patterns in skin conditions that others missed, a gift for connecting seemingly unrelated symptoms to underlying causes. My attending physician, Dr. Marcus Thornfield, had been the first person to praise my work without qualification, without adding caveats about debt or obligation or sacrifice. "You have excellent diagnostic instincts, Valdres," he'd told me after I'd correctly identified a rare condition that had stumped the rest of the team. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The comment had stayed with me, perhaps because it was the first time anyone had acknowledged my abilities without immediately following up with reminders of what I owed in return. Dr. Thornfield became something of a mentor, someone who saw potential in me that had nothing to do with my mother's sacrifices or my accumulated debt. When I'd graduated from my residency, my mother had attended the ceremony with what appeared to be pride, though her congratulations had been peppered with calculations. 4 years of medical school, 3 years of residency, she'd mused over dinner afterward. "Do you realize how much support that represents? How many years I've been investing in your future?" I'd tried to point out that I'd actually been supporting myself through residency, that the small salary I'd earned had been enough to cover my basic living expenses, but she'd waved away my protests. "Living expenses," she'd scoffed, "as if that covers the emotional support, the years of worry, the sacrifices I made to get you this far." Starting my own practice had been terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I'd found a small office space in a converted Victorian house, charming but affordable, and slowly built my patient base through word of mouth and careful attention to every detail. The work was consuming in the best possible way, each day bringing new challenges and the satisfaction of helping people feel better about themselves. My mother had been conspicuously absent during those early years of my practice. When I had invited her to the small opening ceremony I'd organized, she'd declined, citing a prior commitment that turned out to be a book club meeting. When I'd shared news of my growing patient base, she'd listened with polite disinterest, offering comments about how nice it must be to finally be earning enough to pay people back. The success had come gradually, then suddenly. Word spread about my diagnostic skills, my gentle approach with nervous patients, my ability to explain complex skin conditions in ways that didn't terrify people. Within 3 years, I'd expanded from the small office to an entire floor of the building. By year 5, I'd purchased the building outright and renovated it into a comprehensive dermatology center with 4 examination rooms, a minor surgery suite, and a cosmetic treatment area. The financial success had been gratifying, but what meant more was the independence it represented. For the first time in my life, I owed nothing to anyone. My student loans were paid off, my business loans were ahead of schedule, and I'd even managed to build a substantial savings account. The feeling of financial security was intoxicating after a lifetime of being reminded about debt and obligation. I'd moved out of my childhood bedroom at age 28, finally able to afford a small apartment near the clinic. The freedom had been overwhelming at first. The simple ability to buy groceries without justifying every purchase, to make decisions about my own life without considering their impact on someone else's finances. For 6 years, I'd lived quietly, building my practice and my confidence in equal measure. Then had come that afternoon 3 months ago when everything changed. I'd been between patients, reviewing charts in my office, when Ingrid had knocked on my door. "Dr. Valdres, there's a woman here who says she's your mother. She doesn't have an appointment, but she seems quite insistent about seeing you." My heart had sunk even as I'd nodded my consent. I hadn't spoken to my mother in over 2 months, our last conversation having ended badly when she had made yet another comment about my selfishness in not helping with her mortgage payments. The idea of her showing up at my workplace in front of my staff and patients had filled me with a familiar dread. She'd swept into my office like she owned it, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the space I'd worked so hard to create. The medical diplomas on the wall, the expensive furniture I'd chosen carefully, the view of the downtown area through my large windows. I'd watched her expression change as she processed what she was seeing, the realization dawning that this wasn't just a job, but a successful business. "This is quite impressive, Serafina," she'd said, settling into the chair across from my desk without being invited. "Much larger than I'd imagined. You must be doing very well for yourself." There had been something calculating in her tone, a quality I recognized from childhood conversations about money and obligation. I'd felt my defenses rising automatically, the old patterns of guilt and justification threatening to resurface. "I've been fortunate," I'd replied carefully, though the word felt wrong even as I'd said it. Fortune had little to do with the long hours, the careful business decisions, the years of building relationships with patients and referral sources. Fortunate indeed, she'd agreed, her gaze lingering on my computer, my medical equipment, the subtle signs of prosperity that filled the room. It makes me think about all those years of investment, all that support that made this possible. The conversation had continued for 20 minutes, my mother asking pointed questions about my patient volume, my fees, my overhead costs. She'd displayed a knowledge of business finances that surprised me, though, in retrospect, it shouldn't have. She'd always been good with numbers when it suited her purposes. When she'd finally left, promising to call soon, I'd felt unsettled in a way I couldn't quite define. There had been something predatory in her interest, something that went beyond maternal pride in my success. The first letter had arrived 2 weeks later, followed by increasingly urgent communications that transformed my achievement into evidence of my ingratitude. According to my mother's calculations, I owed her not just for the obvious expenses of my childhood, but for opportunity costs, emotional labor, and what she termed investment dividends. She'd researched the average income of dermatologists in our area and calculated what my earnings should be, then demanded a percentage that would compensate her for her years of support. The letters had grown more sophisticated over time, incorporating legal language that suggested she'd consulted with someone about her rights as a parent investor. She'd even included payment plans, different options for how I could structure the repayment of my childhood debt. The most recent letter had included a deadline, 30 days to begin payments or face alternative collection methods. I'd tried reasoning with her during our few phone conversations, pointing out that parents are legally obligated to support their minor children, that what she'd provided was not a loan, but a basic responsibility. These arguments had only made her angrier, her voice taking on the sharp edge I remembered from childhood disagreements. "Don't you dare lecture me about legal obligations," she'd snapped during our last conversation. "You have no idea what sacrifices I made, what opportunities I gave up to ensure your success. The least you can do is show some gratitude instead of hiding behind technicalities." The word hiding had stung more than I'd expected. All my life, I'd felt like I was hiding something, some fundamental flaw that made me unworthy of unconditional love. The suggestion that my success was somehow fraudulent, that I was avoiding my rightful obligations, had triggered responses I thought I'd outgrown. But as the weeks passed and the letters continued, something else had begun to emerge alongside the familiar guilt. Anger, slow building and righteous at the audacity of monetizing my childhood. Clarity about patterns of manipulation I'd accepted for so long that they'd become invisible. And underneath it all, a growing certainty that there were things about my upbringing, about my mother's sacrifices, that deserved closer examination. I'd started making phone calls, casual conversations with relatives and family friends who might remember details from my childhood that I had forgotten or never known. Aunt Ophelia, my mother's sister, had been particularly illuminating during a long conversation that had begun with pleasantries and evolved into something much more revealing. "Your mother was always so dramatic about money," Ophelia had said, with the kind of bluntness that comes from decades of family frustration. Even when we were young, she acted like every expense was a personal martyrdom. "I remember when you were little, she used to complain constantly about the cost of raising you, as if children were supposed to be profitable." The conversation had continued for over an hour. my aunt sharing memories and observations that painted a very different picture of my childhood than the one my mother had constructed. Details about my father's life insurance policy, about Social Security benefits I'd never known existed, about family members who'd offered help that had been refused for reasons that didn't make sense at the time. "She had plenty of money, Sarah," Aunt Ophelia had said quietly, "more than enough to raise you comfortably. The constant complaints about sacrifice and expense, that was never about actual hardship. That was about control." The revelation had been devastating and liberating in equal measure. Devastating because it meant that years of guilt and self-denial had been based on lies. Liberating because it explained so much about my mother's current behavior, her apparent belief that my success belonged to her in some fundamental way. I'd hired a private investigator, not to spy on my mother, but to research my own childhood, to find documentation of the financial realities she'd hidden from me for so long. The report had arrived 2 weeks later, a thick folder of documents that told the story of my early years from a perspective I'd never seen. My father had died when I was 4, leaving behind a substantial life insurance policy that had provided my mother with over $300,000, a sum that should have been more than adequate to support us both for years. There had also been Social Security survivor benefits, quarterly payments that had continued until I turned 18, money that my mother had never mentioned when calculating the supposed costs of my upbringing. But the most shocking discovery had been evidence of a trust fund established by my paternal grandparents before their deaths, specifically designated for my education and care. The account had grown over the years, accumulating interest and additional contributions from other family members, reaching a substantial sum by the time I'd graduated from high school. My mother had been the trustee, responsible for using the funds for my benefit, though there was no evidence that any of the money had ever been spent on my education or care. The documentation showed that my mother had used her position as trustee to transfer the entire trust fund into her personal accounts shortly after my 18th birthday, claiming the funds were needed to repay loans she'd taken out for my support. The transfers had been legally questionable, but not technically illegal, given her authority as trustee and the broad language of the trust documents. Everything began to make sense in a way that was both horrifying and clarifying. The constant complaints about money, the guilt over every expense, the insistence that I owed her for my upbringing, all of it had been elaborate theater designed to hide the fact that she'd been stealing from me for years. The sacrifices she'd claimed to make had been funded by money that was rightfully mine, money that had been intended to ensure my success rather than make me feel guilty about it. The trust fund money would have been more than enough to pay for my entire education without loans. The life insurance and Social Security benefits should have covered all the basic expenses of my childhood with money left over. Instead of being grateful for her sacrifices, I should have been questioning why those sacrifices had been necessary at all. Armed with this information, I'd felt my perspective shift in ways that were both empowering and infuriating. The woman who'd spent decades making me feel like a financial burden had actually been profiting from my existence, using my guilt as a smokescreen for her own deception. The demands for repayment weren't just audacious, they were criminal. But confronting her with this information felt like stepping into a minefield of family dynamics I'd spent years trying to navigate carefully. Despite everything, she was still my mother, still the woman who'd raised me, still someone whose opinion mattered to me in ways I wished it didn't. The idea of destroying her completely, of exposing her lies in a way that would humiliate her beyond recovery, felt both necessary and terrifying. The envelope in my desk drawer contained her latest demands, escalating threats about what would happen if I continued to ignore my obligations. She'd mentioned contacting my professional licensing board, suggesting that my refusal to honor my debts reflected poorly on my character and fitness to practice medicine. She'd threatened to reach out to my patients, to share the story of my ingratitude and selfishness with people whose respect I'd worked years to earn. But she'd also made a crucial mistake in her latest letter, one that revealed more about her current financial situation than she'd probably intended. The payment plan she'd proposed included options for direct transfer to specific accounts that my investigator had already identified as being significantly overdrawn. The sophisticated financial analysis she'd included referenced credit card debts and mortgage payments that painted a picture of someone facing serious financial distress. My mother needed money, not just repayment for imagined sacrifices, but immediate cash to solve problems she'd created for herself. The demands on me weren't just about control or vindication, they were about survival. And for the first time in our relationship, I held all the cards. The question was, what to do with the power I'd never realized I possessed. The documentation in my files was enough to destroy her completely, to expose decades of lies and potentially criminal behavior. But the woman who'd manipulated and stolen from me was also the woman who'd sat beside my bed when I was sick, who'd taught me to read, who'd been the only parent I'd ever known. As I finished with my afternoon appointments and prepared to close the clinic for the day, I knew that a confrontation was inevitable. The letters would continue. The threats would escalate, and eventually my mother would follow through on her promises to involve other people in our dispute. The question wasn't whether to confront her, but how to do it in a way that would end her demands without destroying us both. I pulled the folder of documentation from my desk, feeling its weight as I considered my options. Tomorrow, I would call my mother and arrange a meeting, somewhere private where we could discuss her demands and my responses without an audience. It was time to stop hiding from a confrontation that had been building for decades. Time to speak truths that neither of us wanted to acknowledge. The irony wasn't lost on me that in trying to collect on debts I'd never owed, my mother had forced me to discover debts she'd never paid. The trust fund money alone, with 30 years of compounded interest, represented a sum that dwarfed her current demands by tens of thousands of dollars. The life insurance and Social Security benefits she'd claimed as reimbursement for her sacrifices had been money designated specifically for my care, money she'd diverted to her own use while making me feel guilty for existing. As I locked the clinic and walked to my car, I felt something I'd never experienced in my relationship with my mother: complete clarity about who was right and who was wrong, who owed what to whom, and what needed to happen next. The girl who'd apologized for needing glasses, who'd felt guilty for wanting art supplies, who'd spent decades believing she was a burden, was gone. In her place was a woman who owned her own business, who'd built her own success, and who finally understood that the debt she'd been carrying all her life had never been hers to begin with. The drive home gave me time to plan the conversation that would change everything between us. I would present the facts calmly, without anger or accusation, giving her the opportunity to explain herself before I shared what I'd discovered. I would offer her a chance to stop the demands and preserve what remained of our relationship, though I suspected she would choose differently. By the time I reached my apartment, I'd made my decision. Tomorrow afternoon, after my last patient, I would call Cordelia Valdres and arrange a meeting that was 30 years overdue. I would tell her exactly what I knew about the trust fund, about the life insurance money, about the Social Security benefits she'd hidden from me for decades, and then I would wait to see if the woman who'd taught me to feel ashamed of my own existence had any shame left for herself. And then I would wait to see if the woman who'd taught me to feel ashamed of my own existence had any shame left for herself. The phone call came sooner than I'd expected. At 7:45 the next morning, as I was reviewing patient charts over coffee, my phone rang with my mother's distinctive ringtone. I let it go to voicemail, needing a few more hours to prepare for the conversation that would reshape our relationship forever. But she called again 15 minutes later, then again, each call more insistent than the last. When I finally answered on the fourth attempt, her voice was sharp with frustration and something else I couldn't immediately identify. Fear, perhaps, though that seemed unlikely given her recent behavior. "Serafina, we need to talk immediately," she said, without preamble. "There are some serious misunderstandings that need to be cleared up." The word misunderstandings struck me as particularly rich, given what I'd discovered about our financial history. "I agree, Mother. We do need to talk. Are you available this afternoon?" "This afternoon?" Her voice rose slightly. "This can't wait until this afternoon. I'll be at your clinic in an hour." The assumption that she could simply appear at my workplace and demand my attention was so typical that I almost laughed. "No, Mother. We'll meet somewhere neutral, and we'll do it when I'm not working. My patients deserve my full attention." There was a long pause, filled with the kind of silence my mother had always used to express disapproval. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted to the wounded martyr voice I knew so well. "I see. Your patients are more important than your family. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised." "My patients have scheduled appointments," I replied calmly. "You're asking me to drop everything to accommodate a conversation you've been avoiding for months. We can meet at Rosewood Park at 5:30 today, or we can schedule something for later in the week." Another pause, shorter this time. "Fine, Rosewood Park at 5:30. But, Serafina, you need to understand that this situation has gone far enough. Your ingratitude is affecting more than just our relationship." She hung up before I could respond, leaving me staring at my phone and wondering what she meant by affecting more than just our relationship. The comment had sounded like a threat, though I couldn't imagine what leverage she thought she had. The day passed slowly, each patient interaction feeling surreal against the backdrop of the evening's approaching confrontation. I found myself going through the motions of medical care while my mind rehearsed conversations and outcomes, trying to prepare for every possible response my mother might have to the information I was about to share. By 5:15, I was sitting on a bench in Rosewood Park, the folder of documentation beside me like a briefcase full of evidence. The park was quiet, just a few joggers and dog walkers enjoying the mild autumn evening. I'd chosen this location deliberately, somewhere public enough to discourage dramatic outbursts, but private enough for a conversation that might become heated. My mother arrived precisely on time, walking across the grass with the same commanding presence she'd always possessed. She'd dressed carefully for this meeting, I realized, wearing a tailored suit that projected authority and success. The costume was deliberate, designed to reinforce her position as the responsible adult dealing with an ungrateful child. "Serafina," she said, settling onto the bench beside me with careful attention to her posture, "I'm glad you finally agreed to discuss this situation rationally." The word "finally" was perfectly chosen to suggest that I'd been the one avoiding this conversation rather than responding to her escalating demands. I recognized the technique, the subtle reframing that had made me question my own perceptions throughout my childhood. "I'm ready to discuss it," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "But first, I'd like to understand exactly what you think I owe you and why." She opened her purse and pulled out a leather portfolio, removing several pages of calculations that appeared even more detailed than the versions she'd sent me. "It's all here, dear. 28 years of support, from birth until you moved out of my house. Food, shelter, clothing, medical care, education expenses, transportation, and emotional support. I've been conservative in my estimates, using average costs rather than the premium care you actually received." I looked at the papers she handed me, noting the careful formatting and professional appearance. Someone had helped her with this presentation, someone with financial expertise and legal knowledge. The numbers were broken down by category and year, with inflation adjustments and what appeared to be interest calculations. "This is very thorough," I said, genuinely impressed by the detail. "But I have some questions about the underlying assumptions." Her expression brightened slightly, as if she'd expected more resistance to the basic concept. "Of course, dear. I understand this is a significant amount, which is why I've included payment plan options. I'm not unreasonable." I set her calculations aside and opened my own folder, removing the first document I wanted her to see. "This is a copy of my father's life insurance policy. According to this, you received $312,000 when he died. That seems like it would have covered quite a few of the expenses you've listed here." The change in her expression was immediate and telling. The confident authority drained from her face, replaced by something between surprise and panic. She reached for the document, studying it as if she'd never seen it before. "Where did you get this?" she asked quietly. "From the insurance company. It's public record once the claim is paid." I pulled out the next document. "This shows the Social Security survivor benefits you received on my behalf until I turned 18, approximately $700 per month for 14 years. That's another $117,000, designated specifically for my care and support." She was no longer looking at me, her attention focused entirely on the papers I was placing in front of her. Her carefully constructed presentation was crumbling as I laid out evidence of funds she'd never mentioned when calculating my debt to her. "And this," I continued, producing the trust fund documentation, "is the most interesting discovery. My paternal grandparents established a trust fund for my education and care when I was born. By the time I turned 18, it contained over $90,000. You were the trustee, responsible for using these funds for my benefit." I watched her scan the document, her face growing paler as she processed what I was showing her. The transfer records were particularly damning, clearly showing how she'd moved the entire balance into her personal accounts just days after my 18th birthday. You had over $500,000, designated specifically for raising me, I said quietly. Money from my father's life insurance, money from Social Security, money from my grandparents. Yet somehow, you managed to convince me that every expense was a sacrifice you were making. Every dollar spent was debt I would owe you someday. She set the papers down carefully, her hands trembling slightly. When she finally looked at me, her eyes held a combination of defiance and desperation that I'd never seen before. "You don't understand," she said, her voice taking on the pleading tone she'd used when I was a child. "That money wasn't just for you. I had expenses too, costs related to raising you that went beyond simple food and shelter. The opportunity costs of being a single mother, the career sacrifices I made, the social limitations that came with having a child to care for. The rationalization was so perfectly in character that I almost admired its audacity. Even faced with clear evidence of her deception, she was attempting to reframe the situation as somehow justified. "Mother," I said, using the formal address deliberately, "you stole from me. For 18 years, you took money that was designated for my care and used it for your own purposes while making me feel guilty for existing. Then you spent another 16 years trying to convince me that I owed you money for an upbringing that was funded by money that belonged to me." The word "stole" hung between us like an accusation that couldn't be taken back. She flinched as if I'd struck her, then quickly composed herself, falling back on the defensive strategies I remembered from childhood arguments. "How dare you speak to me that way?" she said, her voice rising. "After everything I've done for you, after all the years of sacrifice and dedication, you have the audacity to sit here and accuse me of theft? You have no idea what it was like raising a child alone, no understanding of the challenges I faced or the choices I had to make." But something had shifted in the dynamic between us. The guilt that had always accompanied her displays of wounded dignity wasn't materializing. Instead, I felt a strange calm, the certainty that comes from finally understanding a situation completely. "Tell me about the choices you made," I said evenly. "Tell me about deciding to hide my father's life insurance money while complaining about how expensive I was. Tell me about collecting Social Security benefits on my behalf while making me feel guilty for needing school supplies. Tell me about transferring my trust fund into your personal accounts while lecturing me about gratitude and obligation." Each question landed like a blow, stripping away another layer of the narrative she'd constructed around our relationship. I could see her struggling to formulate responses that would restore her position as the wronged party, but the documentation made her usual tactics impossible. "The trust fund money was used for your benefit," she said finally, grasping at the weakest of her defenses. "Maybe not directly, but to maintain the household, to ensure stability, to provide the kind of home environment you needed to succeed." I pulled out one more document, a bank statement showing the account where the trust fund money had been transferred. This account was used to purchase a vacation home in the mountains, the same vacation home you sold last year to pay off credit card debts. Money that was supposed to pay for my education was used to buy property for your personal enjoyment. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and increasingly detailed. My investigator had been thorough, tracing every dollar from its source to its final destination. The pattern was clear. Money designated for my care had been systematically diverted to fund my mother's lifestyle while she convinced me that I was a financial burden. I want to understand something, I said, closing the folder of documents. When you decided to demand repayment for my childhood expenses, did you forget about all this money, or were you hoping I'd never find out about it? The question forced her to confront the calculation behind her recent behavior. Was this elaborate gaslighting the result of self-deception or deliberate fraud? Either way, the answer would reveal something fundamental about who she was and what our relationship had always been. She was quiet for a long time, staring across the park at a young mother pushing her child on a swing set. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I never forgot," she admitted quietly, "but I convinced myself that it didn't matter, that the money was just a technicality. I did raise you, Serafina. I was there every day, dealing with your needs, your problems, your demands. The source of the funding didn't change the reality of the work involved." The admission was both more and less than I'd expected. More honest than her usual deflections, but still fundamentally self-serving in its framing of parenthood as work-deserving compensation rather than a basic responsibility. "And the recent demands for money?" I pressed. "What exactly were you hoping to accomplish?" Her composure cracked completely then, tears spilling down her cheeks as she abandoned the pretense of righteous indignation. "I'm in trouble, Serafina, real financial trouble. The house is in foreclosure, my credit cards are maxed out, and I don't have anywhere else to turn. When I saw how successful you'd become, how much money you must be making, I thought maybe you could help. I thought maybe you owed me that much." The truth, when it finally emerged, was both simpler and more pathetic than I'd imagined. My mother hadn't been playing some elaborate psychological game or attempting to reassert control over my life. She'd been drowning financially and had decided that guilt was her best strategy for extracting rescue funds from the daughter she'd spent decades manipulating. So, the letters, the calculations, the threats about contacting my licensing board, I said, all of that was just you trying to guilt me into bailing you out of financial problems you created yourself. She nodded miserably, no longer attempting to maintain any dignity or authority. I didn't know what else to do. I've been living beyond my means for years, and when the bills started coming due, I panicked. "You're the only person I know who has money, and I thought if I could just convince you that you owed me something." The sight of my mother crying should have triggered the protective instincts that had been trained into me since childhood. Instead, I felt a strange detachment, as if I were observing a stranger's breakdown rather than experiencing a family crisis. The revelation that her recent behavior had been motivated by desperation rather than genuine belief in my debt was somehow more insulting than her previous stance. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," I said slowly. "You spent my entire childhood making me feel guilty about money you'd stolen from me. You convinced me that I was a burden, that every expense was a sacrifice you could barely afford, while you were actually living off funds that belonged to me. Then, when you found yourself in financial trouble as an adult, you decided to extort money from me by claiming I owed you for an upbringing that was funded by my own inheritance. When I laid it out that starkly, the audacity was breathtaking. She'd managed to monetize my childhood twice, first by stealing the money designated for my care, then by demanding payment for providing that care with my own stolen funds. "I never thought of it as stealing," she said weakly. "I was your mother. I was taking care of you. The money was all going toward the same purpose anyway." The rationalization revealed so much about how she'd justified her behavior over the years. By conflating her role as my caretaker with ownership of resources designated for my care, she'd convinced herself that her actions were somehow appropriate, that being my mother gave her the right to redirect my inheritance for her own use. "Mother," I said, choosing my words carefully, "do you understand that what you did was illegal? Taking money from a trust fund for purposes other than those specified in the trust documents is a form of embezzlement. Using my Social Security benefits for your personal expenses rather than my care was fraud. The life insurance money might be more complicated legally, but morally, it was meant to help you raise me, not to fund a lifestyle that left you constantly complaining about financial hardship." The legal implications seemed to register for the first time, her eyes widening as she processed the potential consequences of behavior she'd apparently considered merely questionable rather than criminal. "Are you going to report me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hung between us, heavy with the weight of 34 years of complicated family history. I had enough evidence to destroy her completely, to expose decades of financial manipulation, and potentially send her to prison. Part of me, the part that had spent years feeling guilty for existing, wanted that destruction, wanted her to face consequences for the psychological damage she'd inflicted through her elaborate deceptions. But another part of me, the part that had spent years building a successful life despite her manipulation, recognized that revenge would be ultimately hollow. She was already facing the natural consequences of her financial irresponsibility. Her house was in foreclosure, her credit was destroyed, and she was desperate enough to attempt extortion against her own daughter. Adding legal prosecution to her troubles wouldn't undo the damage she'd done to me, and it wouldn't recover the money she'd stolen and squandered. "That depends," I said finally, "on what happens next." She looked at me with a mixture of hope and terror, clearly understanding that her future depended on how she responded to whatever I was about to propose. "I want 3 things from you," I continued. "First, you're going to stop demanding money from me immediately. No more letters, no more calculations, no more threats about contacting my employer or my patients. The fiction that I owe you anything for my childhood ends today." She nodded quickly, eager to agree to anything that might keep her out of legal trouble. "Second, you're going to write me a detailed confession about the trust fund, the Social Security benefits, and the life insurance money. I want you to acknowledge in writing that you used funds designated for my care for your own purposes, and that you did so while making me feel guilty about being an expense. I want the truth documented in your own words so there's no ambiguity about what actually happened." This request clearly made her uncomfortable, but she nodded again, understanding that written confession was better than criminal prosecution. "Third," I said, watching her face carefully, "you're going to get professional help. Financial counseling to address the spending problems that got you into this situation, and therapy to understand why you thought it was acceptable to manipulate your own daughter for money." The suggestion of therapy seemed to offend her more than the other demands. her face flushing with indignation at the implication that she needed psychological help. "I don't think therapy is necessary," she began, but I cut her off. "Mother, you just tried to extort money from me by claiming I owed you for a childhood you funded with money you stole from me. You've spent decades making me feel guilty about expenses that were covered by my own inheritance. If you don't think that behavior requires professional intervention, then we have nothing more to discuss, and you can expect to hear from my attorney next week." The threat was effective because it was genuine. I had reached the limits of what I was willing to tolerate from her. Regardless of our biological relationship, if she couldn't acknowledge that her behavior was fundamentally wrong and commit to changing it, then I was prepared to pursue every legal remedy available to me. "Okay," she said quietly, "I'll do the therapy." "But, Serafina, what am I supposed to do about the house? About the debts? I'm not asking you to pay for my mistakes, but I genuinely don't know how to fix this situation." The question of practical assistance was more complex than the question of legal consequences. She was my mother, despite everything, and the idea of her becoming homeless felt wrong even after all her manipulations. But I also couldn't reward her behavior by simply solving the problem she'd created through her own poor choices. "I'll give you the name of a bankruptcy attorney," I said, after considering my options. "Someone who can help you navigate the legal process of dealing with debts you can't pay. I'll also give you information about social services that might help with housing and other necessities. But I'm not going to bail you out financially. The consequences of your choices are yours to live with." The offer was more generous than she deserved, but less than she'd hoped for. I could see her processing this new reality, understanding that the daughter she'd manipulated for so long was no longer willing to be controlled or guilted into solving her problems. "I suppose that's fair," she said finally, though her tone suggested she found it anything but fair. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us processing the magnitude of what had just been revealed and agreed upon. The relationship we'd had for 34 years was effectively over, replaced by something more honest but much more fragile. "I want you to understand something," I said as we prepared to leave. "The trust fund money you took, with interest and investment growth over 30 years, would be worth more than $2 million today. The Social Security benefits and life insurance money would add hundreds of thousands more. When you tried to claim that I owed you $200,000 for my childhood, you were asking me to pay you less than 10% of what you'd actually stolen from me." The numbers seemed to stagger her. The realization that her financial problems could have been avoided if she'd simply invested my inheritance responsibly rather than spending it on luxuries and vacations. "I know this doesn't change anything," she said quietly, "but I am sorry, not just about being caught, but about what I did to you. About making you feel like you were a burden when you were actually supporting both of us." The apology was more than I'd expected, but less than what the situation demanded. Real remorse would require her to understand the psychological impact of her deceptions, not just the financial irregularities. But it was a beginning, perhaps the foundation for something more honest between us in the future. "I hope you are sorry," I replied, "and I hope you'll use the therapy to figure out why you thought any of this was acceptable. Because until you understand that, there's no basis for us to have any kind of relationship." As we walked back to our cars, I felt something I'd never experienced in my mother's presence: complete clarity about who I was and what I deserved. The daughter who'd apologized for needing glasses, who'd felt guilty about wanting art supplies, who'd spent decades believing she was financially burdensome, was gone forever. In her place was a woman who understood her own worth, who recognized manipulation when she saw it, and who refused to accept guilt for crimes she'd never committed. 6 months later, I received a letter from my mother, handwritten rather than typed, delivered to my home address rather than my clinic. It was the confession I'd requested. 8 pages of detailed admission about the money she'd taken and the lies she'd told to cover it up. But it was more than just a legal document. It was also an attempt at a real apology, an acknowledgement of the psychological damage she'd inflicted along with the financial theft. She'd started therapy, she wrote, and was beginning to understand how her own childhood experiences with money and guilt had shaped her parenting. She'd filed for bankruptcy and was living in a small apartment, working part-time at a bookstore to cover her basic expenses. The loss of status and financial security was painful, she admitted, but also oddly liberating after years of living beyond her means. The letter ended with a request that surprised me. She wanted to know if I'd be willing to have dinner with her, somewhere neutral, to discuss the possibility of rebuilding our relationship on more honest foundations. She wasn't asking for forgiveness, she wrote, just for the chance to try being a better mother than she'd managed to be the first time around. I kept the letter for 3 weeks before responding, using the time to consider whether there was any point in attempting reconciliation with someone who'd caused me so much damage. But ultimately, I decided that the woman who'd written that letter, honest about her failures and committed to change, was someone I could cautiously trust with a small piece of my life. We met for dinner at a quiet restaurant, both of us nervous about navigating this new dynamic between us. The conversation was awkward at first, filled with the kind of careful politeness that characterizes relationships between former adversaries. But gradually, something more genuine emerged. For the first time in my life, I was talking to my mother as an equal, rather than as a debtor or dependent. She told me about her therapy sessions, about confronting the reasons she'd felt entitled to my inheritance and the psychological patterns that had led her to see me as an extension of herself rather than a separate person. I told her about the relief of finally understanding our financial history, about the freedom that came from knowing I'd never actually been the burden she'd convinced me I was. The relationship we're building now is nothing like what we had before. It's smaller, more careful, built on explicit boundaries and honest communication rather than guilt and obligation. We have dinner once a month, carefully scheduled and held in neutral locations. We don't discuss money beyond the basic courtesies of who's paying for the meal, and we've both accepted that the closeness some mothers and daughters share may never be possible for us, given the history we're trying to overcome. But there's something valuable in what we've managed to create from the wreckage of our old relationship, a kind of cautious respect, an acknowledgement that we're both flawed people trying to do better than we've done in the past. It's not the family relationship I dreamed of as a child, but it's honest in ways that our previous dynamic never was. My practice continues to thrive, built on foundations that feel solid now that I understand they were never dependent on anyone else's sacrifices or support. The success feels different now, cleaner. when I know it was achieved through my own efforts rather than at the expense of a mother's martyrdom. And the financial security I've built feels more meaningful when I understand it represents true independence rather than delayed payment on childhood debts. Sometimes, when I'm working late at the clinic or reviewing patient files at home, I think about the trust fund money my grandparents set aside for my education, money that should have made my path easier, but instead became part of an elaborate deception. I think about my father's life insurance policy, meant to ensure I'd be cared for if something happened to him, transformed into evidence of my own financial burden on the woman who was supposed to protect me. But I also think about the strength that came from building a life without those advantages, from succeeding despite the psychological obstacles placed in my path, rather than because of material support I'd been given. There's something to be said for earning everything yourself, for knowing that your achievements belong entirely to you, regardless of what advantages you might have missed along the way. The documentation from my investigation remains in a safety deposit box, insurance against any future attempts at manipulation or gaslighting, but I hope I'll never need to use it again. The truth has already served its purpose, creating space for honesty in a relationship that had been built on lies for far too long. When people ask about my family now, I tell them that my mother and I have a complicated relationship, but that we're working on it. It's a small truth that contains multitudes of more complex realities, a diplomatic way of acknowledging both the damage that was done and the possibility that something better might still be built from what remains. The trust fund money is gone, spent on vacations and luxury items that provided my mother with temporary pleasure before contributing to the financial crisis that exposed her deceptions. The Social Security benefits are gone, redirected to fund a lifestyle that made her constant complaints about money seem particularly hypocritical. The life insurance money is gone, transformed from my father's final gift into evidence of my supposed burden on the family finances. But what I gained from discovering the truth about those lost resources was worth more than any inheritance could have been. The knowledge that I was never the problem, never the burden, never the ungrateful child who owed endless debts to the woman who'd raised her. I was simply a daughter whose mother had confused stealing from her with caring for her, whose financial manipulation had been mistaken for parental sacrifice. And now, finally, I am free.